Hi, my name is Dr. John Douillard, and welcome to LifeSpa.com, where we prove the ancient medical wisdom of Ayurveda with modern science. And today I want to talk about something called distance healing, the quantum power of prayer. You know, there's been many studies that have been done that suggest that praying for someone from a distance can actually have a powerful healing effect. I've written some articles in the past about distance healing. I've written articles in the past about the placebo effect, but there's some really interesting new science that might suggest the mechanism for how this can in fact happen. Now, it isn't like the studies on distance healing and prayer for healing have been just 100%. There's definitely studies that show that there's benefit, but there's some studies that show that there's not. So it's sort of like in the scientific community, there's definitely some skepticism in that regard. But there's plenty of science to suggest that it's something that needs to be investigated. I mean, for example, the placebo effect is well documented to be 35 to 82% accurate. So that's a powerful thing. So when they suggest that when they do a prayer study and they found that it only matched the control, which is a placebo control, well, then we're talking about it matches the placebo effect, which can be 35 to 82% effective, which is pretty darn good. So let me talk to you about some of the studies that have been done on distance healing, prayer groups, praying for people who are not well, and some of those benefits. We'll talk about that. Then I want to talk about the mechanism that may actually help explain this, which is sort of a quantum understanding of healing from a distance, which I think is quite fascinating. So stay with me here. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion. So anyway, let's talk about some of the science. I mean, in an article I wrote on distance healing, you can go check it out. They talked about gifted college students. I think there was about 60 of these college students who were psychically gifted. And they tried to concentrate or meditate on the ability to accelerate or decelerate the growth of E. coli in the laboratory. And they found that they were able to do that. They were able to accelerate the growth and decelerate the growth of a bacterial culture, which was pretty amazing. Another group of about 10 subjects were concentrating on a fungus for about 15 minutes of concentration, and they had about 191 cultures, and they were trying to inhibit the growth of this fungus in the culture, and they found that they were able to inhibit the growth in 151 out of 194 of those cultures, which is pretty powerful, and you can read that science in my distance healing article that I have up on my website. In the article associated with this video that came out with this video, there are other new studies that I want to share with you. One of those showed that there was a group of subjects that were they did some reviews of all the studies that were done on distance healings and prayer groups for healing people who were not well. And one study had over 2,000 different patients were studied. 23 studies were evaluated, which included about 2,000 or so people that were being prayed for. And they found in this one review of all these studies that 13 out of the 23 showed positive effects and 9 out of the 23 showed no difference from the control, which again, the control is the placebo control. So, you know, people still 32 to 35 to 85% benefit just from the placebo effect, which is pretty powerful. You know, many of the Western medical drugs only have to beat the placebo effect in the clinical trials one time to be approved as an FDA-approved drug. So just beating the placebo is quite a hurdle in the scientific community, which is pretty amazing. And another study another evaluation of all the studies and meta-analysis of 90 different studies on distance healing and prayer groups for supporting health found a 71% positive outcome, which was pretty darn good. Another study in Korea where women who were having fertility issues. They had 219 women who had fertility issues, and they found that when those groups, those women were prayed for, that the group that was prayed for versus the group that was not prayed for had almost twice as many pregnancies than the group that wasn't prayed for, which was pretty cool. And they were like, well, it's all placebo, which of course is, 35 to 82% effective, so it's not a bad thing to any way we can amp up and boost and replicate the placebo effect. That's a really good thing, right? But they did a study with certain primates called bush babies, and I guess these bush babies would get wounded when they were young and get cut up, and so they had groups, prayer groups, praying for one group of these bush baby primates, and another group weren't. And they found that the ones that were prayed for, their wounds healed significantly faster. They did blood studies related to healing, and the blood studies changed dramatically, which was really cool because these monkeys didn't know anything about the placebo effect. They had no idea what was happening, and they still had that benefit. But there, again, in the article I cite some of the studies that show that there wasn't any benefit. Most of the ones, there were some that even showed that the prayer maybe did worse than the people who were prayed for did worse than the people who weren't prayed for. So there are studies on both sides of the aisle, but for the most part, those prayer groups usually or typically at the very least match the placebo, and in many cases do a whole lot more. Okay, so what's the explanation for this? How does this really work? Well, I've written some articles also you can go back to. I did a part 1 and part 2 series recently on quantum physics and Vedic science, kind of suggesting that the quantum theory, which talks about field theory, that everything comes from a field and that there's unified field theories that may in fact be consciousness, and I kind of dove into this subject just a little bit. And a lot of the studies are really interesting, and the studies show that this is well documented now, that when you observe something, the process of observing something changes what's been observed. So they shot photons through this double slit barrier, and when the photons went through the barrier and somebody was measuring them or observing them, the photons dramatically changed from particles to waveform. But when they weren't observed, they went right through as particles, which sort of, and they did this, they've repeated this for many, many years now. See, and they have absolute scientific documentation that when you observe something, the process of observing changes something. So if you're observing something and you're praying for someone at a distance, you are observing them. You're just observing them at a distance. So could that observation change the observed? Well, Einstein in the 1930s, he discovered this thing. He called it spooky action at a distance, which means that this observation, the observer changing the observed, happens instantaneously at distances that could even be, on the other side of the planet or even in space, that there's no time separating the instant that the observer observes something. It changes that observed at a distance instantaneously. This is the world of quantum physics, which is, hard for us to wrap our head around, but that's what Einstein discovered and has been well documented since. So with that in mind, could the process of observing something at a distance change them? Well, we know that when you meditate, you actually are observing yourself, and there's powerful changes that take place there. Well, there's some new research that's been shown that the body, our human body, produces photons, and they're called ultra-weak photon emissions, that they're biophotons that our body produces, little photons of light. That's what a photon is. And they're quantum particles, and our body is emitting them, which is sort of new science. And they found that when we meditate and observe ourselves, we change the behavior of these photons. And that's also measured by a massive reduction in reactive oxygen species, which is free radical issues that can take place in the body, are dramatically reduced from meditation. And the mechanism for that is a reduction in the production or the admittance of these ultra weak photon emissions that have been recently discovered. Well, there's more to this story about the photons that we emit as well. They found that these photons are used in our body to communicate between cells, to communicate with our DNA, that these photons are the mechanisms of how, of course we know our microbes do it too, but one of the tools that the body uses are these photons to deliver information. And that these photons are affected by intention. So your intention can change the expression of those photons, sort of like the observer thing, right? The observer can change the observed. So if your intention is something, it can actually change the observed, right? So then that, according to Einstein, spooky action at a distance, that can happen over very, very large distances instantaneously, which is how prayer could possibly work. Well, we also found in these studies that I cite in this article that our skin has receptors for these photons, for these biophotons. So it turned out that this human body of ours is not only a projector or an emitter of these ultra weak photon emissions, but our skin is also a receiver for these photon emissions, suggesting that we do feel and take on these photons, which don't seem to be affected by time or space. Thus the spooky action at a distance, where things can change by observing the observed, by changing the observed, by observing it at a distance instantaneously, right? So that's pretty crazy. I get it, this is all pretty crazy, but if these photons are affected by intention, and those photons are being emitted out of your body and can be altered with intention, say the intention of prayer or the intention of meditation, that these photons can literally be changed by intention. And we have receivers, and they're not limited by time or space, so they can be affected at a distance. And if your attention is to someone at a distance, could these photons be being delivered to that person? And we do have receptors for these photons on our skin that could receive them, and could that elicit a therapeutic change or a therapeutic effect? Anyway, it's maybe a little bit far-fetched for us to wrap our head around. It's definitely not Newtonian physics where X plus Y equals Z. It's definitely quantum physics, and the understanding of quantum mechanics is really changing our world as we speak. And it's a fascinating discovery, but the reality is, it is hard science that we do produce these photons, and we emit them out of our body, and our body can produce them, emit them, and receive them, and they absolutely are affected by intention. And we have hard science to prove that the observer can change the observed, and that can happen at a distance, and it can happen instantaneously. So maybe that is the reason why prayer and distance healing is a thing, and has been a thing for thousands and thousands of years. I've written about that in some articles in the past, how in Ayurvedic medicine, distance healing is like a normal, kind of a thing. If someone is not well, they would pray for them, they would do things for them. There were distance healers. It was sort of a part of the culture, part of the fabric of the culture. It wasn't odd or weird or crazy like sometimes it's perceived here, because we're so locked into hard science. But now we have the hard science that might explain some of these things that were that were part of our ancient wisdom, or at least the culture of ancient wisdom. So check out this pretty fascinating article, and I have a series of articles on distance healing, on placebo, on consciousness and Vedic science, all of which kind of takes us to this article, which is about these ultra-weak photon emissions that our body can produce, that could in fact that are changed by intention, and could actually be a piece of the distance healing or prayer group supporting health puzzle. Check it out. See you next time. I'm Dr. John Douillard. Do you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe and share.
This recording is brought to you by LifeSpa, where ancient Ayurvedic wisdom meets modern science. Get access to free health video newsletters by Dr. John at lifespa.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.